Well, I won't try and imitate a sort of Monty cough at this stage, or no coughing, please. My name's Mungo Melvin. I've been associated with RUSI for nearly 40 years and this conference for nearly 20, so I'm one of the old boys. But it's a very great pleasure to be here to chair this panel. And only last week I was a panelist at another RUSI event commemorating D-Day in Normandy alongside such luminaries as Professor David Stevenson and Sir Anthony Beevor, and then we tried to challenge some received wisdom on the subject, which I hope we will be doing today. But this morning's panel is not just historical, because our aim is to explore some of the challenges of Allied cooperation and indeed the German anticipation and reaction to what is now termed part of the jargon of the day, cross-domain, which in 1944 would have been known as combined coordination when mounting such assessed complex and risky endeavor. And our aim here is to highlight, and I stress this, the contemporary lessons which may or may not be learned. And I would argue that notwithstanding the spectacular success of D-Day and all the associated heroism and sacrifice, which quite rightly will be featuring the media coverage at Southsea Park today and on Normandy beaches tomorrow, perhaps the more relevant lessons for today, if at all, should be found in the subsequent battle. From 7th of June onwards, the battle for Normandy, in other words, in the 10 weeks of campaigning, bitter inland fighting, after the longest day. And furthermore, I would suggest that any contemporary lessons must be derived noting the particular historic, strategic, operational, and tactical context of the summer of 1944, noting that the Allied campaign in Northwest Europe generally, and the fighting on land in Normandy more specifically, cannot and should not be isolated from the enabling maritime and air and operations, and not least from momentous events on the Eastern Front, not least Operation Bagration on 22nd of June 1944, and also, and often overlooked, the conditions and constraints pertaining on the home fronts of all sides involved. The campaign is known for huge controversy, not just surrounding the higher commanders, the big beasts such as Montgomery or Patton, the associated strains and inter-Allied harmony. But as I think we'll find out, there were equal, if not greater, strains on the German chain of command as well. And finally, as one who's studied, walked and talked on Normandy's hallowed ground extensively, I remain convinced, and I hope this panel will demonstrate, that the campaign provides a treasure trove of intelligence, doctrinal, organizational, equipment, and logistical issues worthy of detailed scholarly and professional military study today, as are, crucially, the subjects of morale in battle and leadership at all levels. And with these preliminary observations in mind, I now wish very briefly to introduce our three expert panelists who will speak in the following order. First, on my right, your left, Professor John Buckley from the University of Wolverhampton, author of notable works such as The British Armour in the Normandy Campaign, 1944, and Monty's Men, the British Army and the Liberation of Europe, whom I think I can say in all fairness has taken on the critics of the British Army's supposed lackluster performance in certain aspects of the campaign. And on my left, your right, Dr. Matthias Strohn, Head of Historical Analysis at the British Army's Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research at Camberley, has just had an article about the German Army on the West on the eve of D-Day published, and those of you may have seen it in the British Army Review Special, his article, and it makes him, I think, ideally qualified to give us the German perspective, warts and all. And last, but certainly by no means least, on my extreme left, on the right, Professor Michael Goodman, of the Department of War Studies at King's College London, official historian of the Joint Intelligence Committee. As an aside, it's very good to hear that we still have official historians. not anymore, that's the sadness of it all, and who will reflect on the intelligence challenges and successes surrounding D-Day and Normandy on both sides, and what we might learn with Prophet today in quite different circumstances. So without further ado, John, you have the floor. Wherever you like.
Okay, let's go from here then. Okay. Good morning. When the British Army hit the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, it was an army of mixed emotions about the task ahead of it. Mostly comprised of conscripts, with very little, if any, experience of battle, many soldiers displayed little enthusiasm for the task ahead. Austin Baker, a trooper in 47th Royal Dragoons, recalled that on the 5th of June, quote, Major B read out messages from Eisenhower and Montgomery, said we should be very honoured to be in this affair. I felt most of us thought we could stand the disgrace of being left out of it. Private James Sims, like many others, felt disconnected from the great cause. He said, getting the English worked up to defend democracy was an uphill task. The average British soldier was only interested in three things: beer, football, and crumpet. Yet, despite being a little browned off and bloody-minded, as some of the literature would lead us to believe, this army was also lavishly resourced with equipment, resources, and supported by air and naval power on an overwhelming level. Its weaknesses were centred around a strictly limited pool of personnel upon which to draw, and many of whom had yet to grip or grasp the realities of fighting modern warfare as it existed in 1944. It also seems baffling now that after almost 5 years of war, the British Army was still unsure of how to put all the pieces together: infantry, armour, firepower on the battlefield. Uniformity of approach was not evident throughout the army in the first weeks of Normandy. I think there are arguably three main reasons for this. Firstly, limited contact with the enemy. Although the British state had been at war for 5 years, near enough, most of the army had spent its time training in the UK. A small portion of it had been fighting in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, but for the most part, they hadn't been in contact with the enemy, whereas their opponents, the Germans, obviously had been fighting consistently throughout that period. The second factor, I think, is that the main successful learning that influenced 21st Army Group, the combined British and Canadian forces which fought the Normandy campaign, was drawn from the Mediterranean, and specifically North Africa, and these lessons were not always suitable. Some suspicions remained about 8th Army methods in 21st Army Group, but it was rather difficult to argue openly with the only winning team the army had to that point, particularly if it was led by Bernard Montgomery. The third factor, I think, which shapes why the British Army is unsure of how it was going to fight at a tactical and doctrinal level in particular, was the cultural approach of the British Army. Enforcing doctrine and methods in an army such as the British, with deep suspicion at that time of doctrine, proved difficult. So methods, especially at the tactical levels, brought back from the Mediterranean, had limited traction. The War Office, too, had some difficulty in getting units and commanders to sing from the same hymn sheet when it came to tactical methods, a situation made worse by training with inappropriate weapons that precipitated questionable tactical solutions, all undermined by a lack of practical experience. So when 8th Army commanders returned to the UK to take over command of 21st Army Group, not always a popular move, many of the tactical methods they brought back failed to take hold in a uniform manner. It didn't help that doctrinal advice was often contradictory. It was little wonder that officers sought their own solutions to impending tactical problems in the battlefield. Now, this bred what I think can be described, I described at a conference once with some reservations, it bred a dyslexic army. Intelligent, thoughtful, capable, but one that learned best by doing rather than reading, or being informed by written tactical doctrine. The number of veterans I've interviewed who, when I asked them about tactical manuals, pamphlets that were handed around prior to D-Day, and they uniformly said, oh, we knew they existed, but we never read them, which tells us a great deal about how the British Army approached such matters. It conducted its learning process on an informal basis, which creates all sorts of problems for the historian when we're trying to find out what the British Army was actually doing and thinking in 1944. What resulted was a confusion over how to integrate infantry armour and firepower on the battlefield in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign. Units often had varying ideas and views on how to do things. A good case in point would be the approach of the three orthodoxly organised British armoured divisions in Normandy. The 7th Armoured Division, recent return from the Mediterranean, brought free-flowing open country tactics and a heap of experience and a self-worth that was ultimately was not to be played out with success in the Normandy campaign. The 11th Armoured Division, which was a mix of experience and inexperience, had been reshaped by Pitt Roberts, the youngest divisional commander in the British Army in 1944, and he had moved more towards troop-level firing manoeuvre tactics, but still fought with largely separate infantry and armour formations. Finally, the Guards Armoured Division in the UK had for too long trained using wholly inadequate 2-pounder guns to lay down suppressing fire preparatory to a mass charge across open country, which they particularly liked, but proved not to be workable in the field. So you have 3 armoured divisions, supposedly in the same army, supposedly fighting to the same with the same approach, but clearly not. They all had different ideas on how they were going to operate in Normandy. And infantry armour cooperation was the major issue in Normandy for the British Army. Armoured divisional structures initially separated infantry from armour in separate brigades, a method that was rapidly exposed as wholly inappropriate in the close terrain of Normandy, though it had previously been workable in the desert. Normandy terrain placed a premium on intimate armour infantry cooperation. Notably, within a few weeks, the division settled on a mixed brigade structure when terrain required it, which was more often than not. This was still an issue, however, as it tied the armour to the pace of the infantry, and infantry, even in an armoured division in 1944, was still largely deployed on foot when in contact with the enemy. Only 1 in 4 of the infantry battalions in an armoured division had an armoured half-track transport to move it into and through battle. By late July, British infantry in armoured divisions had adopted tank riding tactics in particularly close terrain, something which had been rejected prior to D-Day as being something that was clearly unsafe and fraught with difficulties and danger, but circumstances dictated the change. The particular examples you can identify with this change occurred in late July and August in the fighting south of Caumont, around Aunay and Montpinçon, Operation Bluecoat, where there's tremendous flexibility and close arms coordination was required. Ultimately, the solution proved to be, in set-piece operational encounters and battles, the use of fully tracked armoured personnel carriers, which started to be used in larger numbers in August. However, the biggest and most important piece of the puzzle confronting the British Army in 1944 in Normandy was integrating firepower, particularly artillery. Artillery was the most important weapon on the World War II battlefield, and British artillery was the best at the time, arguably. And it dominated the battlefield, particularly as far as the German army was concerned. Working within the protective umbrella of artillery was essential to the way in which the British Army functioned. One assessment stated that British tanks, if operating beyond supporting artillery, once under direct anti-tank gunfire, saw their survivability halve every 6 seconds. So operating beyond your artillery support was something that should not occur. Though in Operation Goodwood, July 18th, 1944, it did, with calamitous consequences. Yet, even the artillery wasn't so sure of its methods in June and July 1944. Questions remained around the value of predicted or directed fire, for example. The jury was also still out on the relative balance of stonks, standard concentrations, versus rolling barrages. The former could inflict heavy losses on the enemy by catching them by surprise, but the latter was considered essential to lead infantry onto target with tolerable losses, if infantry leaned into the barrage, which was more difficult than many theorists in the army had imagined. It was constantly repeated through the British Army in 1944-45 that it was better to lean in as close to the barrage as possible, even accepting that you would suffer some friendly fire casualties as a result, than falling too far behind and suffering the consequences of the Germans having pulled themselves together after the barrage had swept over them. The most crucial role for firepower came, however, in the defeat of enemy counterattacks. Shelling dug-in enemy troops suppressed them, more often than not, but it rarely inflicted heavy casualties. The main field weapon of the day, the 25-pounder, had a fairly small range of impact in the physical sense against dug-in troops. The blast radius on dug-in troops about 3 feet 6 inches. The shell had to land to have a physical effect on soldiers dug in. To have a lethal effect, it effectively had to drop right into the trench or the fortification in which the troops were hiding. You had to get the enemy to move to inflict casualties upon them. Then, if you had responsive and rapid artillery, then you would be able to inflict such casualties. And this was the method with which the British and the Canadians decided was the most effective way of dealing with the German army. Operations began with bombardments and air attacks, followed by assault, by infantry and armour, supported by rolling artillery barrages. Occupation of the objective hopefully followed, having not been caused too many problems. Consolidation was a key element. You then had to move your troops up to defend the position you had seized, and do that quickly and reorganise yourself to absorb the invariable counterattack that the Germans launch against the position you had now held. And that's where the damage was done. This was predetermined planning on the part of the Allies. Guy Simmons, the 2nd Canadian Corps commander, outlined this approach in documentation in February 1944 and circulated it to Dempsey, the Second Army commander, British Second Army commander of Montgomery, both of whom completely agreed, but were rather puzzled that Simmons thought it necessary to write it down, because this is what they'd already been doing for quite some time. For historians, it's a really important document because it tells us something about what the British Army was planning to do before D-Day actually began. There are clear examples early in the campaign of how this approach worked. Many people focus on the failure of the armoured thrust at Villa Bocage on the 13th of June and the disaster that unfolded there. But on the 14th of June, from a defensive position, the British Army inflicted very heavy casualties on assaulting German infantry, which is often overlooked. The British still withdrew from the position, but the casualties inflicted on the Germans were quite significant, caused in large part by responsive and flexible artillery. You also see an example of this in the fighting around Hill 112 on the 30th of June, 1st of July, a night assault by the 12th SS across open ground against prepared British positions, supported by heavy concentrations of artillery, which decimated the Germans as they advanced over this ground. By the midpoint, I think, of the campaign, the Commonwealth armies had begun to settle on efficient and effective methods, not flawless by any means, but workable. And what is noticeable is the adaptability of the army. The very weakness, in fact, of the British Army's approach to doctrine prior to D-Day, I would argue, also facilitated flexibility, allowing it to fight to its strengths and to impose its will on the enemy with increasing force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Before I ask Matthias to speak, perhaps just to capture 3 points which are beginning to be echoed in some of the Slido. I very nearly called it Slidex then, but that's something completely different. That's a joke to some of the older military members of the audience, Slidex. The 3 issues of combined arms, firepower and artillery, and then of the adaptability in contact. And I imagine that some of the artillery or gunner members of the audience will lament that we appear to be, the British Army today, rather light on our artillery and long-range fires. So perhaps that we can come back to that issue in the Q&A. For an army that was so strong and world-beating in 1944-45 on the artillery arm, perhaps we've lost sight of that. But now, Matthias.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the German army and the German experience of the battle in Normandy, because, as we all know, war is a two-man game, or as good old Clausewitz once said, well, it's a duel on the grand scale. And I hope you've noticed how cleverly I managed to squeeze the dead Prussian already into the very first sentence. I mean, if that isn't great, I don't know what is. It's the first and only time I mention him, I promise you. It is impossible to really understand a battle or a campaign if you concentrate fully on one side, so that's why we also need to look at the enemy in this particular battle, i.e. the Germans. When you look at The way the Battle of Normandy is being remembered, commemorated in Germany, there is nothing of the scale that you can see in Britain today. So very briefly, I watched it on the telly this morning. You don't have anything like this, what goes on in Portsmouth like this in Germany at the moment. Angela Merkel actually is in England, so she's not commemorating or whatever back in Germany. So why is that? You might say the obvious reason for that is that Germany lost that battle. I mean, that's pretty obvious and clear, isn't it? Not only this battle, but many subsequent battles, and of course eventually the war, which doesn't really help when it comes to all these commemorations. One could also argue that the Battle of Normandy and the outcome of the war in the West had already been decided before the battle actually started. The sheer military superiority of the Allies was certainly the key factor here. By 1944, just to give you a few examples, the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost for the Germans, and Allied strategic bombing had already turned many German cities into rubble. Also, and you might say this is the key point when it comes to the remembrance, it should not be forgotten that by 1944, well, the 6th of June, and then the 10 weeks of fighting in Normandy, that Germany had been fighting an extremely bloody war on the Eastern Front for over 3 years. In total, just to give you an idea, about 80% of all German casualties during the Second World War were sustained on the Eastern Front, not fighting against the Western Allies. The German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, had lost a staggering 1.85 million men between June 1941 and May 1944, and these are only the killed and the captured, so excluding the wounded. On 22nd of June 1944, so while the Battle for Normandy is still ongoing, just about 2 weeks over D-Day, and exactly, and that's why it's important, 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. Mungo already mentioned it briefly, which led to the rapid collapse of the entire German Army Group center in Russia. One could argue that this was the gravest military defeat the German army ever suffered in its entire history. And as Mungo has already said, the entire Normandy campaign has to be seen within this context. To say very clearly, the Germans had already lost the war when the Allies landed in Normandy. D-Day did not change or alter the outcome of the Second World War, although it accelerated the decline of the Third Reich. The inability to push the Allies back into the sea meant that Hitler's great strategic plan for 1944 had failed. After pushing the Allies back into the sea, he intended to move the bulk of the troops from the Western Front to the east to then successfully fight the Soviets. His great plan, as we know, with the benefit of hindsight, was nothing but a castle in the sky. This was also recognized by the leading officers of the Wehrmacht in the West. On 17th of June, in a meeting with Hitler, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who was the supreme commander of the German forces in the West, and Field Marshal Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, you all know him, commander of Army Group B, demanded that the war be brought to an end immediately. Even more drastically, on the 1st of July, Rundstedt told Field Marshal Keitel, he was the head of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, the OKW, when asked what they should do. And he said, "Make peace, you idiots." There's some debate over what exactly he said, but I think you get the idea. Of course, what did not happen was, as we all know, that they made peace, but the next day Rundstedt was relieved of his command. There we go. On paper, on D-Day, the Wehrmacht was still a formidable fighting force. In the West, the Germans had about 1.5 million men. 900,000 in the army, about 350,000 in the air force, about 100,000 in the navy, and about 100,000 in the Waffen-SS. The army could muster in total 58 divisions. The problem was these were of very varying quality. The bulk of these units were standard infantry divisions, and this meant that these guys marched into battle just like their fathers had done in 1914. More than half of these divisions were classed as, to use the German term, bodenständig, which indicated an even lower mobility compared to the normal infantry divisions. And so you can see that the general mobility of the German divisions in the Western Front was even lower than that of the British ones that John's already talked about. Most of these divisions had been formed in the West from 1941 onwards, either as occupation forces or as replacements for units and formations that had been destroyed on the Eastern Front. Their equipment was a pure hodgepodge of weapons and material captured in earlier campaigns. Only approximately 40% of the troops, roughly 60% of the officer corps, had combat experience, again mainly gained on the Eastern Front. To overcome the perceived or real manpower shortage, the German army actually became quite inventive. About 10% of the troops fighting in German uniform were not Germans. The most peculiar of these were the so-called Osttruppen, the Eastern troops, which include Russian, Georgian, and Azerbaijani soldiers fighting in Normandy. Now, if you think about it, well, most of these had volunteered to fight in the German army because the prisoner of war camps were kind of death traps where they'd be starved to death. So you join the German army, you put in a uniform, and you as a Russian in France for the Germans fight against the Americans or the British. Just think about their combat effectiveness. Probably not the most impressive one. The army also formed units of formerly medically unfit soldiers, which they called the famous stomach and ear battalions. Another problem was that this dubious quality of the troops did not stop at the higher ranks. Most generals had been posted to the west because of poor performance on the Eastern Front, health problems, or because they had spoken out against the conduct of war that the Wehrmacht waged in the East, the War of Annihilation. Famous exception to this general rule was, of course, again, Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B, again, the famous Desert Fox, you've all heard of him. He was the youngest field marshal of the Wehrmacht at that particular time. However, Rommel's energy was not enough to overcome homemade structural problems that the Wehrmacht was facing in the West. There's quite a detailed piece on that in the bar. I'm going to keep it a bit shorter, so if you're interested in that, you've got the more detailed version there. On 12th of May 1944, so less a month before the Allies started the invasion, a new organizational structure of the forces in the West was adopted. Rundstedt, as supreme commander of the German forces in the West, was now in command of Rommel's Army Group B up in the north, roughly speaking, the newly formed Army Group G in the south of France, and also Panzergruppe West, Panzer Group West. I shall be using the German term. It just sounds better, doesn't it? Let's face it. That's the way it is. Panzergruppe sounds so much more impressive than Panzer Group. So Panzergruppe West, which had been set up at the turn of 1943 to 44 as a command authority for the mechanized divisions. On paper, this created a pretty tight command structure. In reality, however, in-house fighting over the competencies continued, which resulted, you might say, in a half-baked compromise. 4 tank divisions of the Panzergruppe West, named the OKW Reserve, came under the direct command of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, OKW. You all know the story if you've seen Normandy films when they say, well, the Hitler is asleep, we can't release the tank reserve. And only because, well, then he's awoken at midday, and that's too late to relieve the tank reserve. It's these divisions they're talking about. The remaining 6 divisions were split between Army Groups B and G. There was still no joint command structure, and the Air Force and the Navy did not take any orders from the Army. They were under mere instructions to cooperate with the Army High Command. The Waffen-SS also stood partially outside of Rundstedt's control. The end result of this in-house fighting and Hitler's typical style of leadership of Divide et Impera was a muddled command structure with overlapping responsibilities and duplication of effort. General Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander in the West, summed this up already in January 1944 by saying, "Here everything is so complicated, entangled in a web of 100 possible departments that it takes a long time for a newcomer to understand what is going on behind the scenes." Just to give you an idea what this duplication of effort actually meant, in one period of 24 hours, Rundstedt's headquarters received 8,788 telephone calls. In April 1944, we had over 50,000 members of the Wehrmacht employed in a myriad of positions in Paris alone. So not the tightest command structure you can think of. Organizational matters were made more complicated by an ongoing debate among the senior commanders about the deployment of the tank reserve, you might say the iron fist of the army in the West. Everybody agreed that the so-called Atlantic Wall would not stop an invasion. It was basically supposed to be the tripwire which would slow down the enemy. And the idea for the defensive battle was characterized by a 2-step approach. So you slow down the enemy on the Atlantic Wall, which then gives you time to bring up the strong reserves from the hinterland. But the question was where to place these reserves. The 2 protagonists in this debate were Rommel and a general called Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, good German name, commander of the Panzergruppe West. Rommel wanted to break up the reserves and deploy the tank divisions as closely to the beach as possible. He argued that Allied air superiority, as he'd experienced, for example, in North Africa, would make it impossible for the Germans to move their reserves up to the front line once the landings had occurred. Geyer, on the other hand, had gained his operational experience mainly on the Eastern Front, even though he had served as defense attaché, the first defense attaché after the First World War in London. Wrote a book about it, it's a fascinating read. As a consequence of his experience, he argued that the tank reserve should be held back and only be deployed once the Allied force had landed and the Schwerpunkt, the main point of operation, was clear. He argued that the superior operational skill of the Wehrmacht would be able to defeat the Allies, and they would be able even to defeat a numerically superior enemy, as had happened so often at the tactical operation level on the Eastern Front. And this debate is not just a debate between two generals behind closed doors, but it's of utmost importance for the conduct of the battle on the German side. Because not only is it part of the confused command structure, but it goes straight to the heart of the army's ability to defeat the invader. Because the tank reserve was the perceived trump card of the German army in the West. In contrast to the rather sorry state of the rest of the army, it was pretty well equipped. It had tank divisions, 4 of these from the Waffen-SS, 2 further tank divisions to be brought by the end of June, and some other heavy detachments. In total, they had about 1,600 tanks and tank destroyers. So this force was supposed to turn the tide and ensure that Germany could win the battle in the West, or the campaign. Fortunately, as we know, for the Germans, reality would prove different. The model command structure, Allied air superiority, and resupply issues, on which I'm not touching here because that's such a broad topic and needs a lecture of its own, meant that the divisions were brought to the front line piecemeal. And rather than having this very powerful knockout stroke against the enemy, what you ended up with were a number of mere slaps in the enemy's face. And these strategic and operational problems made the tactical fight more than difficult. Nevertheless, the Germans still believed that on the whole they were the superior soldiers. In tradition with German military thought, they believed that will, determination, and also the willingness to sacrifice one's own life would prevail over the material of the Anglo-Americans. An after-action report from the Waffen-SS Hitler Youth Division shows that very clearly. And I quote, starts by saying, "Tommy is no soldier. He is afraid of the cold steel of the bayonet, and he cannot stand the sound of our machine guns when they open fire." End of quote. What at first glance sounds pretty heroic, doesn't it? And very, you might say, Wagnerian, if you want to call it that. Is actually, in fact, if you start thinking about it, an indirect proof that the Germans could not match the Allied superiority in materiel. The Allies could afford to use their superior firepower, as John has already mentioned earlier. The Germans could not. They put bodies of men against shells, and the result of this approach was clear. Will and determination might break an enemy force, but they cannot break enemy artillery shells. To sum up, the German army in Normandy was acting with an unfavorable strategic position from the beginning. Its alleged operational brilliance was denied partly due to internal quarrels and also to enemy superiority, in particular in the air, and an effective Allied deception plan, which made the Germans believe that the main attack would appear in the Pas-de-Calais area. Tactical actions, as impressive as they might have been at times, caused a high blood loss and could not turn the tide. The question really, when you look at the German army in Normandy, should not be why the Germans didn't win in Normandy, but the question should be how they could fight for as long as they did. Because the German soldiers who fought and died in Normandy fought a losing battle right from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I think if I could just, for the purposes of prompting a few questions later on, if I could hazard us sort of encapsulate your point that for all the supposed tactical virtuosity of the German army overall and with limitations in the West could not compensate for some severe strategic and operational shortfalls, and likewise in the command and control. So a point for today, I think, is, and I say this whenever the opportunity arises, resources matter. And you can be the very best tactical commander, but you may not win. But that brings us on to what the Allies thought about the Germans and what the Germans thought about the Allies. Comes back to this crucial issue of intelligence. So it's my great pleasure now to ask Michael Goodman to carry on the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have small man syndrome, so I'm going to stand, which makes me feel much more impressive. I always feel like a museum piece when people talk about official history, because it has sadly demised, and I'm one of the few remaining pieces of evidence of official history, and that's a whole separate subject which we can come on to, but anyway. So what I'd like to do is, we've heard about the tactical side of what's going on. I want to talk about the strategic level, and particularly the role that intelligence played in military planning. But firstly, a bit of background. Dun, dun, dun. Aha, the magic works. What was the Joint Intelligence Committee? The Joint Intelligence Committee still exists today. It was set up in the summer of 1936. It had its first meeting on the 7th of July in a building not very far from here, met on a day when Hitler was preparing to open the Olympics in Berlin. And it was set up by Sir Maurice Hankey, a Royal Marine, with a very precise idea in mind, that if war was going to come, the military had to have the best possible intelligence for planning purposes. And so from his perspective, that meant you had to have some level of coordination between what were then the three branches of the military that conducted intelligence. So in the summer of 1936, this organisation was created. It was led by an army brigadier for really the precise reason that no one wanted the Navy in charge at that time, and that persevered for a short period. And in the 3 years prior to World War II, it was very much peripheral both to military planning and also to broader assessments of what Hitler might be doing. It met monthly. It looked at topics which were not particularly interesting. Its most significant contribution prior to World War II was not to look at Hitler's intentions, but to look at the Spanish Civil War, to think about were there any lessons that could be taken from the Spanish Civil War for a potential war with Germany. And the conclusion was that there could not be any. The Spanish Civil War was being fought by second-class military powers, the JIC concluded, and Germany was a first-class military power. Therefore, there were no lessons that could be taken away from it. But the committee itself continued, and in 1940, three events really transformed its fortunes. The top there you can see the membership of the committee. It was bolstered in 1940 by the intelligence agencies, MI5, SIS, Ministry of Economic Warfare. It took on a Foreign Office chairman. And the three big events that transformed its position, its stature within the war effort, and which really preempted what role it would have in D-Day, were the way in which Norway was invaded and overrun in April of 1940. Churchill coming to power a month later, a very keen advocate of intelligence, asked the intelligence community who should be telling me that Norway was about to be invaded and why was it overrun so quickly. And thirdly, the appointment of a very, very able Foreign Office diplomat as chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And Victor Cavendish-Bentinck, who would go on to be the Duke of Portland, was very, very good at working with his military colleagues. He was junior to them in rank, but getting the Intelligence Committee to work with the Joint Planning Committee and to work very, very closely with Churchill on what was going on. And the effect of all of these was very, very successful. From 1940, with the aftermath of these different changes, the JIC began to produce a variety of different products for Churchill, but also for the military effort. Here, for instance, is what a typical day's product would look like, a variety of different reports that were being produced. Almost all of those, for the historian in the room, have since been destroyed. So we have no real sense of what its tactical contribution was, other than the provision of lots and lots of reports. What it also did was to produce lots of strategic level reports about various different elements to do with the war effort. And these were often produced over a matter of weeks. They've all been preserved. We get much more of a sense of what the committee did. And the effect of these, the effect of from 1941, the fact there was a team of drafters working, was that from Operation Torch onwards, the invasion of North Africa in 1942, there was no significant military operation that did not involve the Joint Intelligence Committee as the sort of intelligence heart of that operation at the strategic level. How did this work for Normandy in the invasion of Europe? By the summer of 1943, the UK and the US had agreed to a cross-channel invasion of Europe. The initial target date was the 1st of May 1944. And the JIC was central to the military efforts that were going on. This very initial date was considered, but a number of different preconditions had to be met, as you can see on the screen there. And the Chiefs of Staff instructed the JIC with providing warning for when those conditions had been met. The military operations would not go ahead until the intelligence community had said that these different elements had been met. And the view in late 1943, as we've heard just now, was that Germany was on its last legs. It was a question of not when it would be, of not if it would be defeated, but when. The JIC in late 43 concluded the Germans are incapable of regaining the initiative in Russia. And so planning for D-Day continued. In early March 1944, the JIC wrote, as you can see on the screen, Germany is aware that Allied forces are rapidly being built up in the UK. There is some evidence at present that she expects the main attack will take place against the English Channel. And SIGINT, as we now know, the very well-known operations to break the German Enigma codes, ultra codes, were very, very successful. They underpinned all of the assessments that were being produced here, as well as the different deception efforts that were going on. And the deception efforts were absolutely crucial, of course. Concealing the true landing spot was fundamental to how the operation would go on. From late May 1944, a few weeks, the D-Day date had been pushed back. From late 1944, a series of JIC papers looked at what the Germans might know about Overlord. In early June 1944, just a few days before the invasion, the JIC could report, for instance, and I quote, "There is no intelligence to suggest that the enemy has accurately assessed the area in which our main assault is to be made." And Cavendish-Bentinck later reflected on it here by saying the most important fruitful pieces of deception were to make the Germans think we were going to land somewhere else. What was the effect of all of this? The effect was, once the weather conditions cleared and all of the JIC's preconditions, which had been set by the Chiefs of Staff, had been met, on the morning of the 6th of June 1944, 160,000 troops crossed the Channel, accompanied by 7,000 vessels, 12,000 aircraft, and the invasion, as we now know, was very, very successful. As the JIC concluded when they looked back on this a few weeks afterwards, all the evidence suggests that the Germans did not accurately assess in advance the timing, scale, or location of the attack. They do not appear to have appreciated that the weather was sufficiently favourable for a large-scale amphibious operation. And of course, the D-Day landings paved the way, as we know, for the subsequent invasion of Europe and the race for Berlin. And just to reflect on this just for a minute or two at the end, what did this tell us about the role of strategic level intelligence in the war efforts more broadly? At a very broad level, intelligence had a very good war. All the way from the different human agents that were reporting prisoners of war up to the breaking of the German codes. And this meant that the Joint Intelligence Committee had a very good war. It was very much involved with all of the major military efforts. Personalities were very important. The role of Cavendish-Bentinck in bridging the gap between the intelligence and military staffs and bridging the gap between the intelligence and military staffs and Churchill were hugely significant. As were the number of products that were produced. And you can see there some level of just how much paper was produced. This would be taken into the post-war world. The idea that intelligence would be integral to military planning and policy planning would continue. And I think the legacy that the JIC had in World War II and its role in D-Day are tantamount to that. So I shall stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, the questions have been